I never thought a stranger sliding into the seat across from me and whispering, "Please pretend you know me," would be the thing that finally pulled me back into the world of the living. But that's exactly what happened on a cold Thursday evening in late November, in a little corner diner on the edge of Cedar Falls, Oregon, and I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. Her hands were shaking around the menu she wasn't really reading. Her eyes kept darting toward the door. And before I could ask her what she thought she was doing, she leaned in close enough that I could smell the rain in her hair and said those 4 words like they were the only thing standing between her and something terrible. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know what she was running from. I only knew that for the first time in 2 years, somebody needed me, and I wasn't going to look away. But let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand the man I was before she sat down at my table. My name is Owen Reyes. I'm 33 years old, and I live alone in a small house at the end of Mill Road, the kind of house that's too big for one person and too full of memories to ever feel empty. I work as a carpenter. I build things, fix things, restore old furniture that other people gave up on. There's a certain peace in taking something broken and making it whole again, sanding away the damage until the grain underneath shows through. I used to think I was good at that with people, too. I used to think I could fix anything. Then Diana got sick, and I learned the hard way that some things don't come back, no matter how steady your hands are. Diana was my wife. We were married for 4 years before the cancer took her. And the worst part, the part I never tell anyone, is that the last thing I said to her that morning was something about the gutters needing to be cleaned before winter. Not, "I love you." Not, "Thank you for every ordinary day you gave me." Gutters. She smiled at me from the bed and told me to be careful on the ladder, and by the time I came back inside, she had slipped into the kind of sleep she never woke up from. The doctors had told us we might have more time. We didn't. And for 2 years, I carried the weight of that last ordinary sentence like a man carries a stone in his shoe, never quite able to set it down. After the funeral, I stopped going into town much. I stopped answering my phone unless it was about work. My sister called every Sunday for the first year, and I let most of them go to voicemail until eventually she stopped calling every week and started calling every month, and I let those go too. I told myself I was protecting people from the weather of my grief. The truth is, I'd just decided it was easier to be alone than to be seen. I built a wall around myself out of routine and silence, and I told everyone I was fine. Wake up, work, come home, sit in the dark, sleep, repeat. There's a kind of safety in a life that small. Nothing can surprise you. Nothing can hurt you, because you've already lost the only thing that could. If you've ever lost the person who knew you best, you understand that fine is just the word we use when the truth is too heavy to carry into a conversation. People would ask how I was holding up, and I'd say, "I'm fine," and they'd look relieved because that let them off the hook. And I'd go home to a house that still had Diana's coat hanging by the door because I couldn't bring myself to move it. I kept her side of the closet exactly the way she'd left it. I kept her coffee mug in the cabinet. I lived in a museum of a marriage that was over, and I told myself that was the same thing as still loving her. The diner on the edge of town was the one place I still let myself go. It was called Marlene's, after the woman who'd run it for 30 years. And it had the kind of warmth that doesn't come from a thermostat. Yellow lights spilling over chipped Formica tables, the smell of coffee and frying onions, an old jukebox in the corner that only played songs older than I was. I'd sit in the same booth by the window every Thursday and order the same meatloaf and let the noise of other people's lives wash over me without having to be part of it. Marlene never pushed me to talk. She'd just refill my coffee and pat my shoulder and move on. That was enough. That was all I thought I needed. So there I was, that Thursday in November, halfway through my coffee and a paperback I wasn't really reading, when the bell above the door jingled and a gust of cold rain blew in. I didn't look up at first. People came and went all night. But then I felt someone stop beside my booth, and before I could lift my eyes, she dropped into the seat across from me like she belonged there. My first thought was that she'd made a mistake, that she'd confused my table for someone else's. I opened my mouth to tell her so. And that's when she leaned forward, her voice barely above a breath, and said, "Please, pretend you know me. Just for a minute. Please." I should have been confused. I should have been annoyed. Instead, I looked at her face and everything else fell away. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a knot that had half come loose, and a coat that was soaked through at the shoulders. But it was her eyes that got me. They were the eyes of someone bracing for impact, someone who had learned to expect the worst and was waiting for it to arrive. I'd seen that look in the mirror enough times to recognize it on a stranger. So instead of asking questions, I set down my book, leaned back like we were old friends, and said in a normal, easy voice, "There you are. I was starting to think you'd stood me up." Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or surprise that I'd actually played along. She let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she mouthed. And then the bell over the door jingled again, and a man walked in. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing an expensive leather jacket that didn't match the worn-down warmth of Marlene's. His eyes swept the room with the slow, possessive confidence of someone used to finding what he was looking for. He scanned the booths, the counter, the faces. I watched the woman across from me go very still, the way a rabbit goes still when a hawk crosses overhead. She kept her face turned toward me, and I understood without being told that the man in the doorway was the reason she'd sat down. I picked up my coffee like nothing in the world was wrong and said loud enough to carry, "So how's your sister doing? Last time you said she was thinking of moving out to Bend." The woman blinked, caught up fast, and answered in a voice that only trembled a little. "She's good. She's settling in. You know how she is, always reinventing herself." Her hand found her coffee cup, more for something to hold than to drink. The man in the doorway looked our way. His gaze landed on her, then on me, then on the easy, familiar way we were sitting together. I met his eyes and held them, friendly but unbothered, just a man having dinner with a woman he clearly knew well. The man's jaw tightened. He stood there for a long, cold moment, and I felt the woman across from me holding her breath. Then he turned and walked back out into the rain, the bell jingling behind him. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then she sagged back against the seat, like all the strings holding her up had been cut at once. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Thank you. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do." Her hands were still trembling. I slid my untouched glass of water across the table toward her without a word, the same way Marlene would have, and she took it and drank like she'd forgotten what water was. "Who was that?" I asked quietly. She set the glass down and stared at it for a long moment. "Someone I used to know," she said finally. "Someone who doesn't understand the word no." She looked up at me, and I could see her deciding how much to say to a stranger. "I'm Nora," she offered, like it was a peace treaty. "And I promise I'm not usually the kind of person who hides behind men in diners." "Owen," I said, "and for what it's worth, you didn't hide. You picked a table and you handled it. I just played along." That got the smallest smile out of her, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes but is trying. And right then, looking at this woman who had walked in out of the rain with the whole weight of something I didn't understand sitting on her shoulders, I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 2 years. I felt awake. Marlene came by with the coffee pot and took one look at Nora's soaked coat and didn't ask any questions either. She just brought a fresh cup and a plate of fries that nobody had ordered and said, "On the house, honey. You look like you need it." That's the thing about places like Marlene's. They take care of people without making them explain. Nora wrapped her hands around the warm cup and started. Slowly, to thaw. I didn't push her to talk. But over the next hour, the story came out in pieces, the way the truth always does when someone's been holding it too long. The man's name was Vincent. They'd dated for almost 2 years back when Nora was living in Portland, and for the first while he'd been charming, attentive, generous. But the generosity had teeth. He wanted to know where she was every minute. He didn't like her friends, then he didn't like her job, then he didn't like the idea of her having a life that didn't revolve around him. By the time she understood what was happening, she'd been slowly cut off from almost everyone who could have helped her. When she finally left, she left in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and her grandmother's ring and nothing else. She'd moved to Cedar Falls 3 months ago to start over, to disappear into a small town where nobody knew her name. And tonight she'd seen Vincent's car parked outside the grocery store, and she'd known, the way you know these things in your bones, that he had found her. I shouldn't be telling you all this, she said, shaking her head. You don't even know me. You're right, I said. I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's scared, and I know that nobody should have to be that scared walking into a diner on a Thursday night. I paused. Where are you staying? She hesitated. I've got a room above the hardware store on Main. It's not much, but it's mine. Does he know where it is? The fear flickered back into her eyes. I don't think so, but I didn't think he knew I was in Cedar Falls either. And there it was, the thing I couldn't walk away from. I'd spent 2 years building a wall around my own grief, telling myself I had nothing left to give anyone. But sitting across from Nora, watching her try to be brave with shaking hands, I realized that wasn't true. I had a truck, and a quiet house at the end of a road nobody had a reason to drive down, and 2 strong hands that knew how to install a deadbolt. I had something to offer after all. Let me drive you home, I said. I'll check your locks. That's it. No expectations, nothing weird. Just a guy making sure another human being gets home safe. She studied me for a long moment, the way you study a bridge before you decide it'll hold your weight. Then she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Okay. The drive into town was quiet, rain drumming on the roof of the truck, the wipers keeping a slow rhythm. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the dark streets slide by. When we got to the hardware store, I walked her up the narrow stairs to her room and checked the door while she stood back. The lock was a joke, the kind you could pop with a credit card. The window over the fire escape didn't latch. I didn't say anything alarming, but I made a mental list. I'll come back tomorrow with a real deadbolt and a window lock, I told her. If that's all right with you, no charge. I've got the parts sitting in my shop doing nothing. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, I said. That's kind of why I want to. And there it was again, that small smile that was trying to learn how to be a real one. I came back the next afternoon with my toolbox, and I installed a deadbolt that could stop a battering ram and a lock on the window that actually worked. Nora made coffee on her little hot plate and watched me work, and we talked, easy and unhurried, about nothing in particular. She told me she used to be a school teacher before Vincent convinced her to quit. She told me she'd started painting again since she came to Cedar Falls, small watercolors of the river and the hills, and when I asked to see them, she got shy and showed me anyway, and they were good, really good. There was a tenderness in them, a way of looking at ordinary things like they mattered, that reminded me of how Diana used to see the world. I didn't tell Nora that. It felt too soon and too much, but I noticed it, and I tucked it away. Over the next few weeks, something started to grow between us, slow and careful, the way the best things do. I'd stop by with a coffee on my way to a job site just for 10 minutes, just to see how she was. She'd text me a picture of whatever she was painting, usually late at night, with captions like, "Is the sky too purple? Be honest." And I'd lie in my bed in that quiet house and find myself smiling at my phone like a teenager. We started having dinner at Marlene's on Thursdays, no longer pretending to know each other because by then we actually did. I learned that she hummed when she was concentrating, an old song I couldn't quite place, and that she took her coffee with too much sugar, and that she had a laugh that started small and then surprised her by getting away from her, like it had been locked up somewhere and was still getting used to being free. I learned that she apologized too much, a habit Vincent had drilled into her, saying sorry for taking up space, for having an opinion, for needing anything at all. The first time she ordered exactly what she wanted at Marlene's without asking if it was okay, without softening it into a question, I felt like I'd watched someone take a first step after a long time in a cast. And every Thursday I watched her get a little braver. The flinch when the bell over the door rang got smaller. She started sitting where she could see the room instead of with her back to it. And then one week she didn't seem to notice the door at all, too busy telling me about a kid in the watercolor class she'd started teaching at the community center. A little boy who painted everything black and then one day, out of nowhere, painted a yellow sun. He didn't say anything about it, she told me, her eyes bright. He just decided he was ready for yellow. I understood that she wasn't only talking about the boy. Some people heal out loud. Nora healed the way the seasons change, so gradually you don't see it happening until one day you look up and the whole landscape is different. There was one evening I think about more than the others. It had been raining all day, the kind of steady Oregon rain that makes the whole world feel underwater, and I'd brought over a space heater because the room above the hardware store never got warm enough. She made grilled cheese on the hot plate, slightly burned, and we ate sitting on the floor with our backs against the bed because there was only one chair. She had a record player she'd found at a yard sale, and she put on something soft and old, and the rain came down outside, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. I caught her watching me. "What?" I said. She shook her head, almost shy. "I just realized I'm not scared right now," she said. I haven't felt this not scared in years. I forgot what it felt like. I didn't have anything clever to say to that. I just reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and she let me, and we sat there in the warm and the music and the rain, and I thought, this is the thing I thought I'd never have again. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something more than friendship growing. But I was careful with it, careful with her, because the last thing a woman who'd been controlled needed was another man deciding how she should feel. So I kept my hands to myself and my hopes quiet, and I just kept showing up. If you've ever loved someone slowly before you let yourself admit it, you know how that feels. Like standing at the edge of cold water, knowing you're going to go in eventually, taking your time because the wanting is its own kind of sweetness. There were small signs, though, that I let myself collect like a man saving up for something. The way she started saving the seat across from her at Marlene's, even when I was running late, telling the regulars it was taken. The way she'd call me when something good happened, the little boy's yellow sun, a painting she'd sold at the farmer's market before she called anyone else. One Thursday, she showed up at the diner with a paper bag and slid it across the table, and inside was a small wooden box she'd found at a junk shop, water-stained and missing a hinge. "I thought maybe you could fix it," she said, and then, quieter, "I thought maybe you'd want a reason to come by that wasn't me being in trouble." I took that box home and worked on it for a week, longer than it needed, replacing the hinge, sanding it down, oiling the wood until the grain glowed. It wasn't about the box. We both knew it wasn't about the box. When I gave it back to her, fixed and gleaming, she held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me, and something passed between us that neither of us was ready to name out loud. Not yet, but it was there, sitting on the table between the salt shakers and the ketchup, as real as anything I've ever built. But Vincent hadn't left. That was the thing I kept reminding myself, even as the days got warmer and easier, even as the box sat on Nora's windowsill catching the morning light. He was still out there somewhere. And about 6 weeks after that first night at the diner, he proved it. I was at my shop, sanding down an old oak dresser, when my phone buzzed. It was Nora, and the message was just 3 words. "He's here, please." My blood went cold. I dropped everything and was in my truck before I'd even finished reading it, driving toward town faster than I should have, my heart slamming against my ribs. The whole way there, my mind ran through every terrible possibility, and I had to keep telling myself to breathe, to drive, to get there. I'd had exactly one chance to lose someone I loved without saying the right words, and I was not going to sit in another silence wondering if I'd been too late. When I pulled up outside the hardware store, I saw them immediately. Vincent had Nora backed against the brick wall of the alley beside the building, one hand braced against the wall by her head, leaning into her space, his voice low and vicious. She had her chin up, but I could see the fear underneath it. I was out of the truck before it fully stopped. "Nora!" I called, my voice steady and loud. "Everything okay over here?" Vincent turned, and up close I could see what the charm hid. There was a coldness in his eyes that no expensive jacket could warm. "This doesn't concern you, friend," he said. "It concerns her," I said, walking closer, putting myself between them without touching either of them. "And she's a friend of mine, so I'd say it concerns me too." I looked at Nora. "You want him here?" "No," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "I told him to leave." 3 times. I turned back to Vincent. "There you go. 3 times. That's about 2 more than anybody should have to say it." I kept my voice even, but I let him see that I wasn't going anywhere. "Walk away, Vincent. There's nothing for you here." His eyes narrowed. "You think you know her?" You don't know anything. She's mine. She'll always come back to me. And the way he said it, like she was a thing he owned, like she didn't get a vote in her own life, made something go very still and very certain inside me. No, I said quietly. She's not yours. She's not anybody's. She's her own. And the only reason you keep showing up is because you can't stand that she figured that out. I took a breath. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave Cedar Falls tonight. And if you come back, if you so much as drive past this building, there's going to be a restraining order and a whole town full of people who don't take kindly to men who threaten women in alleys. Marlene alone could end your whole life with one phone call. I let that sit. You don't have power here. You only ever had it because she was alone. She's not alone anymore. For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain had started again, soft and steady. Vincent looked at me, then at Nora, and I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The slow realization that the thing he counted on, her isolation, was gone. Then his lip curled and he stepped back. She's not worth this much trouble anyway, he spat, and he turned and walked to his car and drove away. And I knew, the way you know when a storm has finally passed, that he meant it this time. Men like Vincent only stay where the staying is easy. When the car was gone, I turned to Nora, and she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. I didn't think. I just opened my arms, and she stepped into them, and for the first time I held her, both of us standing in the rain in that alley while her whole body trembled with the fear finally letting go. It's okay, I murmured into her hair. It's okay. You're safe. I've got you. She gripped the front of my jacket like she was holding on to the edge of the world. And we stayed there a long time, not saying anything, just breathing, while the rain came down around us. That night, I didn't want to leave her alone, and she didn't want me to. So I sat with her in her little room above the hardware store, and we talked until the sky started to turn gray. She made tea instead of coffee, and we wrapped ourselves in blankets against the cold, and slowly, the way a frozen river breaks up in spring, she let everything out. She told me things she'd never told anyone. About how small Vincent had made her feel, about how he'd start with a compliment and end with a knife, about how she'd started to believe she deserved it, about the slow, terrible work of learning that she didn't. She told me about the night she left, how she'd packed in the dark while he slept, how her hands had shaken so badly she'd dropped the car keys twice in the driveway, how she'd driven 3 hours before she let herself cry. Everyone always asks why women don't just leave, she said quietly, staring into her tea. They don't understand that by the time you need to leave, he's already taken the part of you that knows how. I reached over and covered her hand with mine, and she didn't pull away. You left anyway, I said. Shaking hands and all. That's not weakness, Nora. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard. And then, because she'd been so honest, I told her about Diana, about the gutters, about the morning I came back from the ladder and found the silence that had filled my house ever since. I'd never said it out loud to anyone, that the last thing I'd talked about with my wife was the gutters, that I'd been so sure there'd be 1,000 more ordinary mornings that I hadn't bothered to make that one count. The shame of it had been sitting in my chest for 2 years like a stone. And saying it to Nora, watching her not flinch, watching her not offer me some easy comfort but just listen, I felt the stone shift for the first time. She reached across and took my hand, the way I'd taken hers and held it. You loved her, Nora said softly. She knew that. People don't measure love by the last sentence. They measure it by all the days before. I had to look away for a second so she wouldn't see what those words did to me. Out the little window, the streetlight buzzed, and the first gray light was starting to soften the edges of the rooftops. I think, I said slowly, I spent 2 years believing I'd already used up all the love I had. That there wasn't any left, that a man only gets one, and I'd had mine, and I'd wasted the end of it on gutters. I took a breath that shook more than I wanted it to. And then you sat down at my table by mistake. Nora smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, all the way. It wasn't a mistake, she said. I want to tell you something. That night, I looked at every table in that diner. I clocked the exits, the way Vincent taught me to without even meaning to teach me. And I picked yours. I don't fully know why. You had this book you weren't reading, and you looked sad, but it was a steady kind of sad. You looked like someone who knew what it was to lose something and kept showing up anyway. You looked like someone safe. She squeezed my hand. Turns out I was right. I looked like a guy who hadn't smiled in 2 years, I said. No, she said. You looked like a guy who remembered how and was just waiting for a reason. We sat with that for a while, the gray light growing, both of us too tired and too cracked open to say anything else. And somewhere in that long, honest night, in the tea and the blankets and the buzzing streetlight, two people who'd each decided love was behind them quietly stopped being so sure. After that night, everything changed and nothing changed. We still had dinner at Marlene's on Thursdays. She still painted, and I still built things, and Cedar Falls still went on being a small, quiet town where nothing much happened. But the careful distance I'd been keeping between us started to close, not all at once, but day by day. The first time I kissed her, it was on her tiny landing at the top of the stairs. Both of us laughing about something neither of us could remember a second later. And it felt less like falling and more like finally setting something heavy down. She moved out of the room above the hardware store that spring, into the house at the end of Mill Road, into the home I'd thought would only ever hold a ghost. And the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect, was that bringing her in didn't push Diana out. It just made the house feel like a place where love had lived and was living still. We weren't in a hurry. We'd both learned the hard way that the fast version of love is usually the fragile kind. So we took our time. I taught her how to refinish furniture, and she taught me how to see the way she saw, to notice the light on the river in the morning, to find the worth in ordinary things. She started teaching again at the little elementary school in town, and the first time a parent told me how lucky their kid was to have Miss Nora, I felt a pride so large it embarrassed me. She painted a watercolor of our house and hung it in the hallway and underneath the eaves she'd painted. Faint, almost too small to see, a man on a ladder cleaning the gutters. When I noticed it, I couldn't speak for a full minute. "So you remember," she said gently. "Not the silence, the taking care." I asked her to marry me on a Thursday in our booth at Marlene's, because it seemed right to come full circle in the place where it started. I didn't make a speech. I just slid a small box across the chipped formica and said, "You sat down at my table by mistake and you turned my whole life around. I'd like to keep the seat across from me filled for the rest of it. Will you marry me?" Marlene, who had absolutely been eavesdropping from behind the counter, dropped a whole stack of plates, and the entire diner turned to look. And Nora laughed that laugh that always got away from her, and said yes through tears while the regulars clapped and Marlene cried into her apron. We got married in the fall, a year after that first cold November night. It was small, just a few friends. Marlene in the front row in a hat she'd clearly bought for the occasion, the leaves on the hills turning gold and red behind us. Nora wore her grandmother's ring on a chain around her neck and a new one on her finger. And when the minister asked if I'd take her, I thought about all the days that had brought us here. The rain and the fear and the slow, brave work of two broken people deciding to trust again. "I do," I said, and I meant it more than I've ever meant anything. "It's been 3 years now. We have a daughter, Lily, who is 2 and has her mother's eyes and an opinion about everything. The house at the end of Mill Road is never quiet anymore, and I have never been so grateful for noise in my life. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is finally still and Nora is asleep beside me, I think about how close I came to missing all of it. How I almost spent the rest of my life sitting alone in a booth, believing I had nothing left to give. How a stranger walked in out of the rain and whispered 4 words that cracked the wall I'd built right down the middle. I think about Vincent sometimes too, though less and less. The last we heard, he'd left the state. He never came back. Men like that count on you being alone, and the moment you're not, they lose the only power they ever had. I hope somewhere Nora's example reached someone else who needed it. I hope somebody else learned that the door out is real, and that there are people on the other side of it who will hold it open. But mostly I think about that booth, and the bell over the door, and the way she dropped into the seat across from me like the whole rest of our lives depended on it. Because it did. If you've ever wondered whether one small moment of kindness can change everything, whether choosing to look at a frightened stranger instead of looking away can crack open a life you thought was already finished, let me tell you what I know. It can. It did. She asked me to pretend I knew her, And somewhere in the pretending, I found out who I still was. A man with two good hands and a heart that wasn't as empty as he'd thought. A man who could still build something out of what was broken. Last Thursday, we took Lily to Marlene's for the first time. We sat in our booth by the window, and Lily smashed a handful of fries with the focused seriousness of someone doing important work, and Nora caught my eye over the top of our daughter's head and smiled. And I thought about how the table that had held only my grief for 2 years now held my whole world. I reached across the chipped formica and took my wife's hand, the same way I had 100 times, and she squeezed it back. And outside, the rain started to fall, soft and steady, the way it had on the night that started everything. Only this time, the rain didn't sound like loss. It sounded like coming home. And if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Sometimes the person who saves your life walks in the door looking like they need saving themselves. Sometimes the seat across from you, the one you thought would stay empty forever, is just waiting for someone to sit down by mistake and stay on purpose. I almost looked away that night. I'm so glad I didn't.